It's expected we spent about $1.7 trillion on the arms trade and the military in the last year. And you will have seen a clock that I had running on the amount of money that was being spent in real time right now on the arms trade on the screen behind me while we were eating. It's an extraordinary amount of money. And underneath it, I had, you will probably get my voice at this level and at other levels during the evening. Underneath that running vast amount of money, we had a couple of other things that we might want to spend that money on and what it could do. Now, 1.7 trillion is an extraordinary amount of money. Does anyone want to hazard a guess how much of the UN budget that would cover? For all of the work that it does, all of the refugee assistance through the UNHCR, all of the cultural preservation by UNESCO, all of the maternal welfare programs run under UNICEF, the health programs run worldwide by the World Health Organization, the labor programs run by the ILO, the huge buildings that they have in New York, Vienna, Geneva, flying diplomats all around the country, all around the world, costs a lot of money. Last year we spent enough on the arms trade and military expenditures to cover all of those expenses by the UN for 70 years. Now, someone will pick out very quickly, we haven't even had a UN for 70 years yet. So this is one of the questions that we have around this. Isn't there something better that we could do with this amount of money? Now, to a certain extent, I think I'm preaching to the choir in this room. There are people who will argue against this. There are other human needs that could be funded with this. It's not a good way to use our money. It's a dead-end investment. When you invest in the infrastructure in the country, you're building support for an economy. Weapons are used primarily for destruction. This is what they're designed for. This is what military forces are trained for. And the Arms Trade Treaty was a process that was brought about to address this. Canada is a country that is involved with the arms trade. It has been, well, in the last year that we have records for, which is 2010, it ranked number 14 on global expenditures on its arms and the military. This is partly because of economic ranking, but more interesting is how much it's sold. Canada has been in the top 10 or 15 arms merchants in the world over the past decade. And so this is going to condition some of Canada's response to what our movement and this new convention has put in place. And I'll be speaking some more details about that later. This one deals with exports. Canada has exports to a variety of parts of the world. One of the conditions that the Arms Trade Treaty has is trying to put human rights conditionality on the arms trade. There's very little morality involved in the trade in arms. And Canada is one of the few countries that has human rights conditionality on its arms sales. But I think something needs to be adjusted in it. In the bottom corner here is a Canadian-made LAV-3 armored personnel carrier. It was sold to Saudi Arabia, who used it to roll into Bahrain and quash the uprising that was happening in Bahrain against the monarchy. And 30 people died and several hundred were injured due to the actions of the Bahraini authorities as well as the Saudis. And at least some of their equipment was made in Canada. This should have been caught. I mean, where's the human rights conditionality? Just in January, a possibility for selling automatic weapons to Colombia. they don't need more automatic weapons in Colombia, has been opened for Canadian distributors. So even though the conditionality is there in Canadian policy, there's a problem here. This is a quote I actually just came across by Henry Ford. I think it's a great one. He says, "You want to stop more wars, show me who makes a profit from it." And this is the place where the rubber meets the road on that. This is where the profits are being made in the way of armed conflict. And it's estimated by Transparency International that almost 40% of our global burden of corruption is involved with the arms trade. And the reason for this is not too difficult to figure out. Most decisions about the purchases of arms are made in secret. It's behind an opaque wall. Most people don't have access to it. In Canada, we can investigate these things fairly openly. It still doesn't mean there's openness in the Canadian system. Remember 2 years ago when the F-35s were sprung on the Canadian public with apparently no other contracts being considered. What happened behind that? Almost certainly there was some corruption involved. But in many countries, you can't even ask these questions. You will find yourself hounded out of your work, or worse. So the opaqueness around arms purchases leads to a closing of freedoms for many people. And it also is a breeding ground. When people can't see it, when they can't monitor what's going on, it just fosters corruption. It fosters illegality. The 2013 Arms Trade Treaty, which I'm going to be talking about in more detail later on, does not really address this problem. It does not provide for public scrutiny of arms trade, of the arms trade. And so this is a problem that we're going to have with the new convention. The place where the big nexus between the arms trade and human rights issue is when arms are used, the human rights violations are very obvious. We see it on our evening news. The number of people that are killed by arms is reaching about 500,000 per year. The number of people injured is about 10 times that. That's the easily seeable physical cost. But one of the places where arms really impact human rights abuse is when they are not used directly. I was involved in one study where we were looking at the human rights crime of enforced disappearance. And I was dealing with human rights campaigners in a variety of countries. And I was asking them what type of firearms were used, because we were trying to bring out this element in human rights crime. And they said, well, the person disappeared, there was no firearm used, or we wouldn't know. And this was something that the human rights investigators were not actually looking at. They weren't actually looking at the type of firearm that was used. But we dug into it a little bit deeper, and we found that for the human rights crime of enforced disappearance, 4 things had to be there. There had to be the political will of the state to commit the crime. There had to be impunity. There had to be agents. And there had to be arms. When the groups came to seize people and disappear them, if they weren't armed, the seizure usually failed because people would not cooperate with them. Their neighbors would come and argue about it. People would run away. But when the arms were present, they weren't used. They weren't fired. But then people obeyed. People were scared to come to the defense of somebody who was going to be disappeared. And so this is a place where the situation with arms in the world today meets the human rights dialogue. There's another example I'd like to give of this. I was involved with a very edgy project. It was what you would call close support human rights observation. We put human rights defenders from outside of a country near people who were in their country and were targeted for possible extrajudicial execution by their government. And we put people near them 24 hours a day in their house, in their office, everywhere. And we did this in order to raise the social cost of assassinating them, because it would mean an international would witness the event and might be involved. And countries can assassinate individuals within their country if they do it away from the diplomatic missions, the wire service offices, and the tourist resorts with very little cost. So we wanted to raise the social cost by doing this type of close support to them. And while we ran the project, we didn't lose a single individual. The threats didn't stop coming, but it actually showed to be a very successful way of protecting human rights activists within a country. And within our own group, we were looking at abductions, because people were usually abducted before they were killed. And we tried to figure out how to respond to an abduction if it was attempted on us. So we studied failed abduction attempts. And if you want to know how to defeat an abduction, this is the instructions. Scream and run. Now that sounds ridiculous. But what we discovered on looking at failed abduction attempts was whenever something drew attention to the abduction area, the abductors frequently fled because they wanted to be as invisible as possible. And whenever something unexpected happened, the abductors fled. The abductors were usually low-level soldiers who were tasked with this, who were very nervous and frightened themselves because they knew they were doing something illegal. And so we found when unexpected things happened, they pulled up beside a person they were going to abduct on his bicycle, and he was so surprised he fell into the gutter and they sped away. Just when something unexpected happened, something that drew attention happened, the abduction frequently failed. So this ended up with our instruction. If an abduction takes place, scream and run. And also run in a pattern. They don't usually take a shot at you, but if they did, they're less likely to hit something vital if you're weaving in a pattern. So again, this was another place in which we were looking at the impact of arms on human rights abuses. The beginning of the movement towards having an arms trade treaty started in 1997 with a group of about 8, it was a group of 8 Nobel Peace Laureates who met in New York, and they put together a document called the Code of Conduct on Arms Transfers. And the Nobel laureates said, well, we probably cannot stop the arms trade today, but let us put certain conditions on it. And if it has to occur, it should occur within these conditions. And those conditions included human rights conditionality, international humanitarian law conditionality, and human development conditionality. They defined what arms were within that code of conduct. It was made as a legal document that governments could sign on to. They defined arms as all arms, and then they had a very extensive list. They defined transfers as any movement between jurisdiction, change of ownership, any possible change in the circumstances around the arms, and they had a fairly extensive list as to what a transfer would mean. So it basically covered all movements of all arms, including military training for military and police forces, intelligence gear, dual-use technology, military technology, and so forth. All of these were included. The compliance with international human rights standards was if you had a reasonable, if you could reasonably come to the conclusion that these were likely to be used to violate human rights, the transfer should not go forward. And they had an extensive list of the human rights crimes that should be considered under this conditionality. Under international humanitarian law, anything that would violate the Geneva Conventions, and it also called for cooperation with international tribunals and other things that would fit under international humanitarian law topics. They had another conditionality, which was that people in the country where the arms are going should have the right to participate in the political process that decides the leadership of the country. There should be freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of assembly within those countries. The military and the national security policy should be under the control of civilian institutions. no transfer should take place if there was an international arms embargo on the country, or if there was military sanctions declared by the United Nations on that country. There should be participation by a country in anywhere any arms are sent in the annual UN Register of Conventional Arms, which is a voluntary thing by states. There should be a commitment to promote regional peace, security, and stability, which meant that countries should be committed publicly to resolving their disputes on territory through third-party settlements, and also no arms transfer should take place that would affect a balance of power by sticking in a very modern weapon system in a region where no other country had it, which would ignite an arms race within that region. And it also should be taken on self-defense conditionality. Is this weapon really necessary for the self-defense of the country, or is it above that? If it's above that, it should not be transferred. The country should be involved in all of the major conventions combating terrorism. If they're not, then the transfer should not go through. And there was finally the promotion of human development, which included, I'm going to have to check my cheat sheet because I don't remember. That was indexed according to the state where you're going to transfer the arms, their expenditures on health and education, and it should not, their military expenditures should not exceed the health and education budget combined. So that was what that conditionality was. So those were the conditions that the Nobel Peace Laureates had put out, and had put together this code of conduct, and it had a legal structure to it, and states could sign on to it. So does that seem like a reasonable thing? If we're going to have an arms trade, do those seem like reasonable conditions to put on it? I think most of us would agree that this is a reasonable and Nobel effort. And essentially, if it was applied to the arms trade today, how many arms do you think would be traded? Zero. Yeah, it would probably be very, very small. And so 3 years after they put this out there, no states had signed it. At that point, a group of non-governmental organizations met with the Nobel Peace Laureates and said, well, let's take this framework and give it to some international law lawyers, international law institutions, and put it together as a convention that governments could discuss. And so they took all of the principles of that, and this was the Control Arms campaign, which there is a couple of pieces of literature laying around here from the Control Arms campaign that was put together. And this group basically put together the framework convention and offered it to governments saying, this is what we want you to discuss. And all of these principles were within that document. Now, there was some dissension within that group as to how we should move forward to get a convention. I was of the opinion that we should try an Ottawa-style process, which is outside of the United Nations system. The Ottawa process, which brought about the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, was something that was manifested between the international campaign to ban landmines and then the very good government of Canada. And moved forward outside the United Nations system. It had a lot of firsts. It was one of the first conventions to discuss military matters that had a huge civil society involvement. It had the fastest number of ratifications. It's got an extraordinary number of states that have now joined it, 80% of the world's governments. And it's really it's changed the state of the world in relation to that issue. And so there was a certain section of people within the campaign who wanted to go by an Ottawa-style process. But others said, well, we're not going to get the key armed states in if we do that. They'll stay outside of it. So another sector said, let's go to the UN system with it. And there's a possibility that if it fails in the UN system, we can always take it outside and do an Ottawa-style process. And that was the decision then to go to the UN. Now that's dangerous because you're essentially turning this document over to the governments to do what they like with. And they did. So for 2 years, the first hurdle was getting the governments to agree to talk about it. That took 8 years of lobbying. So from 2000 to 2008, it was lobbying the governments to get them to that point. And then we finally got them to that point. They had 2 diplomatic conferences to discuss this in 2011 and 2012. Getting my years mixed up now. Anyway, there were 2 diplomatic conferences at the United Nations, and the way that the disarmament mechanism works within the United Nations is they like to use consensus. And this gives you the lowest common denominator. What North Korea agrees to, all the rest of us agree to. This is what consensus gets you. Consensus also gets you something else, invisibility. Nobody needs to look bad for opposing something. So this is why the UN likes to use consensus and hates to vote on anything. They'll avoid voting at all possible costs. They absolutely failed to get an arms trade treaty by consensus. There just wasn't the international consensus out there to get it. And at the end, this month, in April, this month, 54 states said, with you, we're going to take it to the General Assembly for a vote. And that's what they did. Canada wasn't one of those states. On the 2nd of April, it was voted on in the General Assembly, and it is now a treaty. This is essentially the end of the writing process. Okay? So there's a treaty out there that somebody can sign, some say. On June, it will be opened for signature. That's when governments can sign on to it. Nobody's signed it yet. It doesn't open for signature until June. That's when governments can start signing on to it. And then they've got their own process on it. Now, what is this thing that they developed? The Arms Trade Treaty does not cover all arms. It covers 7 categories of arms that were essentially in the UN Annual Registry, which is a voluntary reporting mechanism. And it covers the major conventional weapons: attack helicopters, armored attack vehicles, missiles and launchers, military aircraft. There's a couple of other things in it, and they added on small arms and light weapons. So these are the categories of arms that are covered. There are a lot of things it doesn't cover. Transfers are defined as international trade. There are a lot of loopholes in that. The governments that will eventually join this convention are to provide annual reports to the Secretariat of the convention. They don't need to provide anything to the public. States will not authorize an arms transfer who join this convention based on certain human rights conditionality. But it's not, you can reasonably believe that they would violate human rights. It's if they tell you they're going to violate human rights. So if you say to a country, well, will you use this to wipe out your indigenous population? They say yes. We were going to say, sorry, we can't sell you the arms. Would you like some anger management? The same thing goes for international humanitarian law conditionality on it. It's there, but the bar is very, very high, and it gives lots and lots of wiggle room. It does have some of the other conditionalities of the Code of Conduct, such as joining terrorism conventions. They're all real big on terrorism. And protocols around transnational organized crime and so forth. So when you compare them, And this is original, by the way. I did this for this presentation. I've never seen this actually done. If you compare the original Code of Conduct with the 2013 convention, what you've got is it doesn't cover enough of the arms trade. It doesn't cover drones. It doesn't cover sensitive military technology. It does not cover military training. It does not cover all transfers. It covers some. It covers straightforward export, import, and so forth. It may cover brokering. The language is vague. But it would not cover leases. It would not cover loans. The Nobel Peace Laureate's Code of Conduct demanded absolute transparency. This one has some transparency. The states have to tell the Secretariat. The Secretariat might leak it to us, but it's not direct transparency. Both of them have human rights and international humanitarian law conditionality, but the conditionality is so much weaker in the Arms Trade Treaty. On the issue of human development and the impact of the trade or transfer on human development, the Arms Trade Treaty is silent. Didn't discuss that. The Code of Conduct acknowledges self-defense, but says it cannot the transfer cannot negatively impact the environment in which the state is in. So self-defense is seen as a limit, where within the Arms Trade Treaty, self-defense is seen as a permission. They both have language on terrorism, but on non-interference in the work of human rights organizations, vigorously pursuing any violations of human rights. I'd forgotten to mention that. That was in the Nobel Peace Laureate's Code of Conduct. Nothing is said about this in the Arms Trade Treaty. On the issues of democratic governance, participation in decision-making in the country, civilian oversight of the military, freedom of information, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the Arms Trade Treaty is silent. And another thing that was in the Code of Conduct was the state that you're transferring arms to cannot be involved in doing inflammatory propaganda, hate speech, and so forth. The Arms Trade Treaty is silent on those things. So this is what our negotiators said while they were in New York. They didn't say anything about human rights. They didn't say that this should be a part of any conditionality on the arms trade. They demanded that any treaty that come out of the process allow the trade in arms. Well, it is called the Arms Trade Treaty, duh. They argued for the domestic gun lobby. And they suggested that any administrative mechanism for this treaty be done out of existing UN funds. In other words, we don't want to see any more money going to govern the arms trade. And they wanted to see, if there was transparency, they wanted to see respect for corporate confidentiality. Ooh, yes. Well, they got it. So what we have today is an extremely flawed document. Nobody has joined it yet, and we won't know how many states have a positive attitude towards this until they start signing up. It doesn't matter what they voted in the UN on this. They can all vote positively on it and never sign it. So the real vote comes when they put the pen on the paper. And once they do that, the strength of this convention will come with the implementation legislation that the government of the country that signs develops. It will only be as strong as the implementation legislation of the government that signs it develops for governing themselves. And they can go beyond what the treaty asks for. There's even some language within that. This is the basic minimum, but states can go beyond that. They have permission to do so within the treaty, the 2013 Arms Trade Treaty. So what needs to be done right now in Canada is there needs to be a focus on getting good implementation legislation. We've got some ideas from what they were saying at the convention about where they're going to want to weaken any domestic implementation legislation in Canada. So getting strong language there and trying to build in some of the stuff again from the Nobel Peace Laureate's Code of Conduct. There's no reason why Canadians can't introduce this into domestic legislation. We do not want to trade with any country that does not have these institutions. If there is no civilian oversight of the military in that country, we shouldn't be trading with them. Canadians can say this, Canadians can write it into their legislation, and the policy will have to follow that. So this is where the effort needs to be right now, is putting together strong implementation legislation. And the system in this country, I think, as many of you know, is the implementation legislation has to be written before the government can ratify the convention. They're currently trying to put across very weak implementation legislation for the Cluster Munitions Convention, which Canada signed but has not yet ratified. Our movement is actually trying to destroy the implementation legislation in the Canadian Parliament because it is the worst in the world. So it's going to be a lot of work to get good implementation legislation. We can see that already from what they were saying. We can see it from what they're doing on the Cluster Munition Convention. But this is where the effort needs to be now. So the controls on Canada's arms trade will not be put in place by the 2013 convention. They will be put in place by the implementation legislation involved with this convention here. That's something we have in our hands. That's the end of my presentation. I'll take any questions you might have. No. However, the Mine Ban Convention, the Ottawa Convention, is not yet universal. There's a number of problem states that have stayed outside of it, but we have conditioned the international environment in which they exist to the point that basically nobody's using them anymore. The production has virtually vanished. International trade stopped a decade ago. And all of the up indicators, the victims are dropping every year, more mines, land is cleared and turned back over to productive human use. So it's a very effective treaty, even though it isn't universal. There are about 20 countries, 20% of the countries are still outside of it. So it has a conditioning effect. It has a conditioning effect. We've conditioned the international environment in which governments exist, and that has an impact on them. The place on the UN agenda where this treaty was shoved into the General Assembly by 58 states was the agenda item on general and complete disarmament. Do very many of you remember where that wording came from? Do you remember the proposal by the President of the United States that was given to the UN through the Secretary that was a proposal for the dissolution of all military forces in every country in the world and transference of that expenditure to human development? Yeah. Nobody knows about this. It's always amazing. I bring this up many places and everybody looks like, what have you been smoking? This was a proposal that was made by the United States in 1962. The Russians made a counter proposal, and together they put forward a proposal for the dissolution of all military forces in the world in a set period of time, transference of that budget to human expenditures, the complete dismantlement of all military bases, and there was also a line in there on no propaganda that can incite war. It was quite an interesting document. And I went to look for it on the UN document website recently and found out that it wasn't actually even there. And I asked the library for a copy of it because it exists on a few arcane websites, but it wasn't actually on the UN website. So they put it back up. And that was just this year that they put it back up. But the phrase general and complete disarmament comes from this process. It was put forward by the Russians and the US in the early 60s. And this has been an agenda item that steers all work on disarmament in the United Nations system. We are supposed to be moving towards a world where we have no further military forces, that we've transferred all of that to human development, and then we've dismantled all of our military apparatuses. This is the goal. This is the goal in the United Nations. This is what all the diplomats were talking about 35 or 40 years ago. All of the top diplomats. And today, it is so far removed from people's memory that it seems like you're talking about utopia and, get a grip, kid. And so that's where this term, general and complete, comes from. And it's in that section of the United Nations agenda that we're supposed to be working towards with our disarmament measures that the Arms Trade Treaty was brought up. So that's a little bit of arcane UN history there for you all.
Why can't you shout about it a bit more? Who was the president? Was that Kennedy?
That was Kennedy.
Yeah.
Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Yeah, but the actual document was named after the negotiators in the U.S. and the USSR at that time, and it was Zorin and McCloy. So it was the Zorin-McCloy Agreement on agreed principles for disarmament negotiations in the UN system by the USSR and the U.S. It was a big, long title.